Need another.
Are you calling the preschool?
No, this is different.
Okay, welcome back. Welcome back, Online Sangha. Friendly reminder to check your mute as you come back in. Happy to have you unmute as you participate with us here. Let me see if I can get in our screen. Get that. How about this morning? Okay. Can you hear me online okay? We're back? Turn your mic on.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Would love to give a very warm welcome to Jodi Walker. Welcome her back again for our second conversation. Jodi Walker is a speech language pathologist, mother, and a resident Oak Parker. She first took race-conscious dialogues in 2017 and then became a facilitator later that year. She deeply believes that racism is a white problem and that solutions benefit everyone. So thank you for being here this morning and continuing the conversation with our Sangha. A warm welcome to Jodi.
Thank you. So nice to be here. I wanted to start today's work is going to be a little more experiential and a little more where we're all going to be doing stuff. So let's start with a little grounding, and then I'm going to just want to get a sense of where we are in the room in terms of like people's work that they've done already, so we don't, so we can move forward and not repeat stuff we've already done. So let's bring our feet onto the ground best you can. People at home, modify this as you can depending on your space. We're going to try to find all four corners of your feet, or if you're crisscross, like I was just sitting, find your base. If your feet are on the ground, spread your toes. Stack your ears over your shoulders over your hips. Bring your hands into a comfortable position. Take a couple breaths to find your own pace this morning of inhale and exhale. And then matching your own rhythm, we're going to do a pattern of inhale up onto your toes and exhale onto the heels. This is a little vagus nerve exercise that gets your vagus nerve grounded and online. So inhale toes, exhale heels, and we'll do it 10 more times. Thank you all, I appreciate that. So the one concept that we would want to go over if folks are not familiar with it as we start to move into some of this work is everyone familiar with the concept of the dominant narrative? Is there anybody who would like that reviewed? Dominant narrative. Okay. Yep. Let's get a little closer, sorry. All right, so the dominant narrative, generally speaking, is the sort of water that we all swim in. So in the United States, that would be the ethics of the colonizers. That's what we would be looking at here. So it would be white, male, cisgendered narrative. The dominant narrative can be very hard for people who are racially privileged to recognize because it privileges us, and so it's hard for us to see. So dominant narrative is a class all in of itself, but basically when we talk about that, what we're referring to is the water that we swim in that is the system that benefits racially, we'll talk in this case about racially privileged, but also gender privileged, and so on, folks, non-disabled, everything you could think of that would be in the middle without the margins. So that would be the dominant narrative. And there's stories. There's stories that we tell ourselves about what's the right way to do things. And this is where well-meaning white folks can run into snags, is not recognizing what is the dominant narrative, because there are assumptions that we don't even know that we have. So any thoughts on that? Any questions about that concept?
The question in the room was, is there a dominant religious narrative?
Yes. So that's a very interesting conversation when we think about the dominant religious narrative. In the United States, it is Christianity, and Christianity with a lower C. So folks will sometimes come into the class and say, well, I'm not Christian, I'm a recovering Catholic, as I am. But the way we think of it is, if you put up a Christmas tree, then you are a Christian with a lowercase c. We had some very interesting, I remember last time, conversations about where religious marginalization intersects here, because one thing about religious marginalization is it's not always visibly apparent. So you can sort of come in and out of that. Not always, and there are many, many cases where you cannot, in terms of it affecting. Whereas a racial marginalization, a visibly disabled marginalization, something like that, you walk around with that and are not able to decide when and if you're going to be, revealing that marginalized identity. So, is that, okay, sure. Anything else on dominant narrative before we sort of get into what we're going to be doing? Okay, and we can talk about it as we go, we're going to, but I just thought if that was a brand new concept. All right, I'm gonna play a remarkable clip that comes from an interview with Charlie Rose and Toni Morrison in 1993. There's so many remarkable things about this, including how she handles Charlie, but we'll play this, and then we're gonna take some time, if everybody's up for it, to kind of go around and have each person sort of talk about their feeling in response to this. Feel free to use your name, your pronouns, and then we'll launch into what you feel after you hear this. All right, here we go.
Yes, I do, Charlie, but let me tell you, that's the wrong question.
Okay, what's the right question?
How do you feel? Not you, Charlie Rose, but don't you understand that the people who do this thing, who practice racism, are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and a distortion. It's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. It feels crazy. It is crazy. And it has just as much of a deleterious effect on white people, and possibly equal as it does black people. I always knew that I had the moral high ground all my life. I always thought those people who said I couldn't come in the drugstore and I had to sit in this funny place, I couldn't go in the park.
Superior to them from day one.
And I thought they knew that I knew that they were inferior to me morally. I always thought that. And my parents always thought that.
You said your father was racist because he always felt like he was superior.
That's right. He always felt superior. And that was a form, of defensive racism. But if the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race. It's also constructed. It's also made. And it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away. And there you are, all strung out. And all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself? I mean, these are the questions. Part of it is, yes, the victim, how terrible it has been for black people.
But you don't like that.
I'm not a victim. I refuse to be one.
And the victim is the other person who is morally inferior. And
that's a serious question.
To
of course.
Racism
if you
to
have
somehow,
to hold, that's
or his or her own self-esteem and definition.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
Then give white people some free advice.
They're all in my books.
And the advice is,
All in her books, because definitely she didn't know him for advice. Okay, so let's take a beat. Yes. He said, then give white people some free advice on what they should do, and she said, it's all in my books. She said, no, I will not. Because what she's saying, right, is that's not my work to do. So when folks wonder, for race conscious dialogue, our classes we have affinity groups for our classes. So they're white groups, and then we have non-Black people of color groups, and we're open to any kind of affinity group, but that sort of explains why. And in terms of the history, I'll give real quick on race conscious dialogue. It came out of a conversation. You can go to the website for the full story here, but it was a community conversation years and years ago with some Black women and some white women, a real deal, like authentic conversation about what do we do about this town, because Oak Park at that time and continues to evolve in its ability to live up to its professed values. And so what came out of that meeting was the Black women asking the white women to handle this piece, like getting white folks ready to come to the table without causing additional harm to the Black people in the room. So anyway, that's a very short version of where this organization came from. Long time ago now. They've been around since, I think 15. So, okay, so we're gonna go around and do our, you can say your name if you'd like and your pronouns, and then just a brief reflection on what you heard. And everybody doesn't have to go, but I maybe unmute yourself if you'd like to, or maybe raise hand if you.
I could start here in the room. This is Kelly, she, her, and I like that reflection piece you offered with, who are you without racism? Who are you? I think that ties to what we do here a lot of times of examining the ego or taking a look at ourselves and what we are outside of constructs.
This is June, she, her. So that was interesting about, white people, if you have to be on your knees to be, if people of color need to be on their knees for you to feel taller. That was interesting. And it seems to me that it's actually both are victims of this system. So that was an interesting thought for me.
I'm Ken, he, him, and the last time you were here, I remember, I think, going over the subject of how I don't identify as being white because I have been visibly excluded a lot of times when some of my quote unquote fellow white people found out that I wasn't Christian. And to Ellen's point, that my Jewishness is sort of white with an asterisk. So that's just sort of a different relationship that I have to it.
Yeah. I think it would be so interesting to do an affinity group with Jewish folks to figure out, because that comes up almost every class that we have.
I think we discussed that at some point. I'm still willing to work on that if you are, so
Yeah,
we'll
sure.
do something there.
Sure.
be happy to participate in that. Can you hear? Yeah. Ellen, she, her. I noticed my strongest reaction was actually the end piece when Tony said, kind of read my books. And what I identified with is the exhaustion of the conversation, and how exhausted she must be. And I'm not even, right, so much affected, but the exhaustion of this conversation of equality.
My name's Kathy. I use she, her pronouns. And something that just struck me was, wow, this was 1993. and it's interesting I think back to where I was in 1993 and what I remember the perceived kind of culture being at the time, and just how, we've had, there have been these amazing voices, who are telling us, the same things that we're, and then here we are in Oak Park, having these conversations, and it's like, it's kind of this, new idea, almost feeling like, oh yeah, Black folks shouldn't have to be doing this work, like white people should be doing this work. And just like how, slow moving, slow the progress has been, I guess.
My name is Dove. I use she, her pronouns. Thank you for this. This is going to sound crazy, but as I listen to this, I've been binge watching The Equalizer on Netflix, which has Queen Latifah in it and it's a powerful show because you think you understand. You think you are not racist. You think you are see people equally, and then you see these stories as they unfold. As I've watched probably 10 episodes now, and I feel like it's been such an education, in what she's talking about, like the depths of how these people are treated through the systems and their crimes, and the things they're accused of, that they, just all the inequities, and so. That's what I'm bringing to this today and a recommendation. I think that's a great show. I think she's like a pop star, but the show is amazing and you learn so much. So I'm glad you're here today, and thanks for letting me share that.
Well, thanks for coming back. It's been a couple of years. I told you earlier, I remember your first talk and enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to this one too. I'm a little bit fascinated with the dominant narrative, and as an example, I do reporting, and I recently did some reporting that caused me to interact with some Indigenous people in Ontario, Canada. And in their public announcements and exchanges with me, they referred to not wanting to be governed still under colonial rule. And then you would ask them another question, and then they would sort of revert to modern times because they live in the modern world. And should they be going back and forth, or this is just the way it is? And I didn't judge them, I just kind of managed my way through it. I referenced their reluctance to be still ruled by colonial priorities. If you have any thoughts on that.
That's very interesting. Let me put it to the room before I share my thoughts. Anybody have any thoughts on that? On this idea that, I don't know if I can say this, reframe it without saying what I think. So any thoughts? Tell me your name again, I'm sorry, on what Gary said. Oh yeah, so I'm gonna try without. Okay, so what Gary, repeat it again for me, with the mic, that'd be great.
So a shorter version, there's some legal issues around environmental issues in Ontario, Canada, in the Six Nations indigenous community there. So in my exchanges with them, sometimes they talked about still being governed by colonial ideology and laws. And then later they would respond to a question because they live in the modern world. They work in the community, they go to the schools and all that. And that going back and forth.
Yeah.
I think that, Dove, you mentioned The Equalizer. I used to watch a lot of courtroom dramas, and I think Gary's point is sort of like fruit from the poison tree, that if the historical basis of it is problematic, it will always find its way back into modernity. You're not fixing it, you're hiding it, you're obscuring it, you're not addressing the root cause. And so I see that as, that's how I see as a marginalized community, is trying to be in the present and in the modern, but can't escape the colonial backstory that shaped everything else. That's at least my read on that.
So what do we think about the question we're even asking? And I'll let, you go first, and then we'll deconstruct just the question.
Okay, I mean, I guess what I was going to say is that, if I'm imagining myself as, I think there's like the system, which is so big that we have to live in, that is the water we swim in. I mean, there's colonial rule and the desire to be free of that. And, I think when, as I think white people, it's easier to hear like, oh yeah, we want to get rid of racism. But then when you hear like the bigger systems that are connected with that, like capitalism, then, oh yeah, we don't want to mess with that. I mean, there are all of these different systems that, are so big. And I guess I don't understand, also just about the question, I'd be interested to know, like, specifically, I mean, we are living in, like, modern times, and so it's sort of, I guess, why wouldn't there be sort of discussion about things in terms of modern times? Because that's how we're living now. I mean, everybody's living, the people you spoke with are living, and so even though, I guess going back, I mean, we're, living with the colonial rule still within our systems, but I guess I'm just not sure why there wouldn't be, I guess, conversations around like what's happening in modern times. Or
I'm so glad you spoke. That was the direction I was thinking too, is the question itself has some dominant narrative to it, right? This idea of it's either this or it's this. And also, who controls modernity, right? Indigenous folks have been here throughout our history and beyond, and before, obviously, but even under colonial rule, Indigenous people modernized with everybody else, right? So that modernity is not something that the dominant culture owns. And modernity looks different in different communities. What Indigenous folks, and it's different for different tribes, so they're not a monolith. We all learned that in this election, no one is monolith. But the way that modernity has weaved its way into the culture has been taking what works and some of what doesn't work, of course, and keeping traditions too and weaving those together. So if you reframe it that way, of course they have questions, they have modern responses to things because they're modern humans in the United States, right? So it's just deconstructing that idea that there's, even, it's a paradox, and it's a very much of a both and. You guys are Zen people, so you should be living with that. But this idea of like, there is a dominant culture, but it has also been shaped by the people who live here. Not, you know, not entirely just, and it looks different. How the frame is different depending on the culture. Does that make sense? Does that sort of? What's modernity? So modernity, I guess, would be, that is another thing that could be a full class, but like modernity could be the use of computers or wanting, you know, I mean, actually, it was your kind of phrase. So how would you define modernity from what you were talking about?
I guess just existing, dealing with the reality, you kind of hit on it, dealing with the reality. Like I said, that the indigenous people, the tribes, they go to schools. Sometimes they go to the tribal schools. Sometimes they go to their community schools, just like the rest of us. So to your point, it's not either or. Some of the criticism that I've heard coming from the dominant narrative is that the tribes sometimes want to see it both ways and take a position in whatever's convenient for them. I'm not taking a position on that, but I don't know, modernity is 1900s, 2000s.
So they lived through those times, right? And yeah, so, and of course, I think all of us look out for our interests, and that definitely can change. You know, so I would say the tribes are not the only groups that will, you know, be looking out again for their own interests. But yes, somebody was going.
Last comment. I just want to make it clear that I was reporting what I saw, not taking a position.
Just absolutely, absolutely. Somebody else
Over here, Pat. Yep.
These are tricky conversations. I'm just so grateful that all of you are here and open.
Hi, I'm Pat, she, her. As we were all talking, for me, what came up was this idea of a homogeneous modern culture shaped by the past versus separation, separatism, small groups, the idea of the melting pot versus the crazy quilt image. And for me, I'm more comfortable with a quilt image. I'm more comfortable with a great variety of expressions, of religions, of cultures. But I think the dominant narrative is that unity leads to strength. And so some of those differences could be shaved away. And finding that balance between unity and the great flowering of different cultures and different religions and different identities. You know, that to me seems to be one of the great tensions. Sorry, I talk with my hands, as you can see. I think I need to be one-handed here. Do I need to repeat any of that? To me, there's a tension between unity and homogeneity on one side and cultural diversity and flowering on the other.
And what's the right way versus, you know, in other words, like what the dominant culture tells us is the right way that things should be done. And it's impossible. In fact, we're going to get into it, and I'm excited for this. We're going to get a little bit into our own racial development, into our own racial histories in a moment. Let me check the time, make sure we have, time flies in this room. So unless anybody has anything they want to add from Zoom. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit into, you know, our own personal racial history. So this will be the stories, what we're going to be reflecting on here is the stories that we heard across our lifetime. I would like to start with another grounding where I'm just going to go through and have you, with more of like a gestalt mind, just listen to what we're going to be reflecting on with more of our left brain mind when we write, to say, okay, just to let it wash over you as we think about what we're about to write. Then we're going to take some time to write, and then we will come back together and share as we feel comfortable sharing. This is pretty personal stuff. And I'm also going to tell you, I'm giving you a little preview of what Race Conscious Dialogue does. So this is all comes from the first of the 4 classes, where we do this very deeply personal piece. But I felt like if any crew was going to be ready for this, that you guys would be. You'll have to ask, I'm not sure. Well, I mean, you don't have to speak. Don't feel like you have to speak, yeah. We're gonna, I mean, personal stuff in that, we're gonna be talking about these are hard conversations, right? So, but it doesn't have to be like, you get to choose how you share, and what you share. Okay, hold on, let me just get to it here. So we're gonna close. Okay, so when you're ready, we'll just close our eyes and find our feet on the floor again. And we'll do 3 breaths with equal inhale, exhale through your nose into your belly. Think about our own narrative of socialization around whiteness and race. We'll have 4 buckets: early childhood, your teen years, young adult, and then from adulthood to now. So let's start with a brief reflection here on your childhood. First awareness of race and whiteness. And you don't need to write right now. We're just reflecting on it. We're going to have time to write. So just in your mind, reflecting on the feeling before we get more into the language. Earliest years, our first awareness. And then moving along in our lifespan to our teenage years, the messages we got at school, at home, in the community. And moving on to our young adult life, early work life, maybe early years of parenting, home, in our religious spaces, in the workspace, in the community. And then moving into whatever modern times are for you in your particular lifespan, whether it's middle age, whether it's older age, whether it's the end of young age, to now. Now we'll spend some time writing this out. So 4 columns, and you can break it down from any way you'd like. Typically, we do like first memories until maybe, middle school, and then maybe middle school through college, depending on how old you are. There's some young folks in the room, maybe college or early work into, the beginning of middle age, the 30s, whatever, and then we'll do modern times. Yep, so childhood, teenage years, early adulthood, young adult, and then full adult. As you're working on this, I want you to think of this as a starting point and to hold on to this, because you'll be able to fill more and more in upon reflection. So don't think you have to get every last thing in there. This is the beginning of thinking of this examination. We have 2 or 3 more minutes. Okay. 30 seconds, and then we'll start sharing. All right. So, does anybody want to start with their earliest messages received at home, the community, those first realizations that there was such a thing as race, and or messages about, anything sort of related? Anyone want to share?
Sure. This is going to sound funny, but it's true. I grew up in a homogenous place. I didn't know it at the time, but I didn't know about people that looked any different than me. And then when I did, I saw people who were Black. I just assumed they had their own supermarket, TV stations, and it's like my exposure was really limited. My parents weren't racist, or what I would call racist. I think it's just curious, don't you think? It's like I just thought, they had their world and I had mine, or it's kind of interesting to think about.
Thank you.
My experience was the same. It's just like I grew up in a white world. Although I remember I did have the Little Black Sambo book, and looking at the time, I remember thinking how smart the little boy was to outwit the tiger. And that's really my only memory of childhood. And then later, I was about 9 or 10, and I was in the Girl Scouts, and they were desegregating the Girl Scouts. They were integrating us. And I remember we were at a camp, a Girl Scout camp, and there were some Black Girl Scouts there. And I remember picking up on how uncomfortable the adults were and really watching us to see how we would react. And we were just like Girl Scouts. So a really homogenous world to grow up in, and then discomfort around the idea of race.
I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which I realized was storybook fantasy integration. It was a white, middle class, predominantly Jewish area, but there were people who weren't that. They were the helpers, they were the doormen, they were the handymen, they were the people who worked at, the guy at Gennaro's, the old Italian dude. And I just noticed that there was this hierarchy, and to the point of your book, Pat, the book that comes to mind that just struck me as being the most incredibly racist one that I grew up with was Curious George. and just looking back and breaking down this incredible construct of this is the way, isn't this happy, isn't this great, isn't this picturesque? Yeah, for me, as a child.
Which, P.S., you didn't ask for, right? Like, this is our earliest memories. We come in with nothing, and we come in, not quite a blank slate, but certainly, yeah, so.
Yeah, so I grew up here in Oak Park, and actually, like, for me, it was more interesting, like, my early childhood memories. Like, I don't remember having a lot of awareness of, there was a lot of Black people in my classrooms growing up, and, like, we had friends of just, you know, like, I don't think we noticed it that much in early childhood. It really wasn't till after that where I noticed like a pretty big shift. But I would say kind of growing up, I didn't have a ton of awareness, and it wasn't anything that really, like, as I think back, like really resonated as anything I'd like really noticed that much.
Mm-hmm. And you don't have to, but if you're comfortable, when did you first start to notice, and what did that shift look like?
Well, I first noticed it probably in like 7th grade is when I felt like there was a shift, and then like our friend group, which used to be a much more integrated group, started segregating. And then like over time, I think maybe both sides felt a little less comfortable, like, oh, I don't really like fit in with this, some of my old friends that I used to hang out with and used to be friends with. They were kind of in like more all Black circles, and I was in more all white circles, and there was this like kind of like fear, or like maybe I don't really fit in with them, or maybe they felt the same way, like they didn't fit in with us. But there was, you know, it's just interesting, like I do feel like there was a point in time where somewhere around there where things changed pretty significantly.
And I think that a lot of kids are still experience that here in Oak Park.
Yeah.
I grew up in the suburb of Detroit, and it was, I think they published, the local paper published a statistic that of a town of 30,000, there were 3 Black families living there. I was never exposed to, rarely, any Black people. And then I was drafted into the Army, and went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and in basic training, there were all kinds of Black people. And my drill instructor, on day 1, I found out, was a rather stout Black sergeant who was taller than me and very imposing, as drill instructors are. And I said, well, this is interesting. That was really my first extended exposure to anybody who wasn't white.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
So I grew up on a sugar cane plantation in Hawaii. And so in elementary school, a lot of my friends were Japanese and Filipino, few Hawaiians, Portuguese, and maybe one white person, one white classmate. And the owner of the plantation was white, right? So that was interesting. And I grew up with stories. I found out later that my grandfather, who came on the boat from Japan to work, was really like an indentured servant, right? He thought he was coming here for, a better life, but he was pretty much like a slave on the plantation where they had, but it was interesting because the bosses who were watching over workers were sometimes Portuguese, which is, I guess, white, but not really in Hawaii. And they would actually whip, if they weren't working, they had a whip and everything. So that was my growing up. But we all got along, but we kind of stuck in our own ethnic group. And then I noticed when I visited Los Angeles to be with my aunties, that's a bigger population group than Hawaii, where my aunt lived, she lived right next, like in a black, kind of an integrated black Japanese community. And so there was friction between Japanese and blacks also. So that was interesting too. They kind of stuck together and not with the whole, population. So that was interesting, I thought.
Anyone online? Yeah, Eric? I know we're coming up about 7-8 minutes left here.
Yes. So, I think there's one of my earliest experiences was, I think one of my mom's coworkers was my first black playmate when we were kids. When like on weekends, my mom would work in the office sometimes. But I just wanted to mention, so I grew up in North Riverside, which is not far from Oak Park, and it's right across the street from a more integrated community. I mean, right now, North Riverside is much more integrated than it was. But we always grew up with like, there's North Riverside, there's Broadview, then there's Maywood. And it was really much more segregated to a certain, degree. So we had, there were black kids that played with us, we had black friends. A lot of us, I'm of Mexican American heritage. A lot of my friends were Indian or Asian or, Czech. So we were a diverse group, except we didn't really have any black friends. And I've always felt kind of the spoken sometimes and unspoken word was always kind of like, well, we don't really associate with black people. And it wasn't like enforced, it wasn't rigidly racist, but it was just there, always there. And I just remember a little bit of irony. The white kid in my school that always wore like Confederate flag shirts or hats, or that came from that kind of family, he was the one that always played with the black kids. And so it's just a little bit of a different take on that.
Oh, I wish we were in the full class because we go on and on about this, but we don't have a lot more time. But you can see the beginnings of what you can just listening to these stories. And when we zoom out on what systems have done traditionally, right? We understand why there were no black kids in your neighborhood. There was redlining. We understand why schools were more segregated, especially in terms of like recent immigration and black folks, because we understand the trend that all groups have done of upward mobility and just making sure that we're not associated when you come into a new place with the most marginalized group. Very ironic, right? Considering that most black folks here in the United States are more American than anybody sitting in this room and have been here longer, but still somehow it's just always this othering. So what I'd like to do with the last couple minutes here that we have, 4 minutes. We're gonna end with a little meditation. I'm just gonna read through this cycle of socialization. You just, ground your feet, whatever you want to ground yourself, and close your eyes. And this starts from birth, and we're going to weave our way through, and then there are 2 paths at the end from the now. So as you close your eyes, we're born into a world with the mechanics in place. No blame, no consciousness, no guilt, no choice. We have limited information, no information, or misinformation. That include biases, stereotypes, prejudices, history, habits, and traditions. That's what we're born into. That's the beginning. Our first socialization, we're taught on a personal level by parents, relatives, teachers, people we love and trust, the shapers of the expectations, the people in charge, the people with power, the norms, the values, the roles, the rules, the models of way to be. And as we start to move into our institutions, school, medical, religious, institutional cultural socialization starts to kick in, we're reinforced and bombarded with messages from churches, schools, television, legal systems, mental health, medicine, business, cultural practices, song lyrics, language, media, patterns of thought. This happens on conscious and unconscious levels as our identity is being formed. And the beliefs that we come out of are enforced, potentially sanctioned, potentially stigmatized. We're rewarded for some, punished for others. Some of us are rewarded privilege based on these reinforced messages, some persecution, some discrimination, some empowerment. Those are our enforcers. And what that results in as we move into our adulthood is some cognitive dissonance, maybe some fear and silence, some anger, dehumanization of certain groups, guilt, we all know that one, collusion, ignorance, self-hatred, stress, lack of a sense of reality, some horizontal violence. Some of those stories came up today. Inconsistency, crime, internalized patterns, internalization of patterns of power, really internalizing it. And now is where we can cross off, where we can veer off in two directions. If we think of it like a moving walkway, we can just staying still, we promote the status quo, we don't make waves, we do nothing. And then that arrow goes right back to the next generation, the same cycle happening. Or we change, we raise our consciousness, we interrupt, we educate, we take a stand, we question, that's where we start, we reframe. And that's the direction for change. So let's take one more moment here to sit with that, and then I'll give a brief closer. So I think this group is really ready for its own workshop. And Race Conscious Dialogue can come in and give that to you. It's 12 hours of work, and I'm happy to come back every couple of years anytime you would like me to. But I do feel like the deeper work takes time. It takes time, and it takes trust, which you guys seem to already have, you know, some trust with each other. It takes commitment. You showed up here on a snowy day in the middle of January to talk about this. It takes vulnerability. So many of you with verbal and nonverbal presence showed up here vulnerable today. So I just feel like this is a crew that that is really ready to dive into some of this deeper work, either with us or elsewhere. But I do invite you to take this day, not as just a course, but as an invitation to the beginning of, a lifelong, very rewarding journey.
Well, thank you so much, Jodi, for being here. I know we are at time. This conversation could definitely continue. I will be in touch with you. Can you see me in line? Let me move this side. Thank you. Oh, I'm back and forth. Thank you all for being here this morning. So great to see all your smiling faces online. For those of you who are able, please join us in the community room for kinship, fellowship, and snacks. Have a lovely snowy Sunday.
I just want to thank Jodi.
Yes, my pleasure. pleasure. It was lovely to be here.
Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful morning. I really, really appreciate your presence, and I'm very glad you came back again.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It was wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Robin.
I love that my original date got bumped because there was a hula. How was the hula thing? Was that great? I thought, I want to come to that. Oh, thank you. Well, thank you all. I appreciate you. Oh, thank you. I'm sure. Thank you.
I found myself still in the water.
Yes, yeah. It just takes unwinding.
So I imagine like when we're in the water, some of us have life jackets.
Yes.
And I kind of attached identity to the life jacket, which will either pull you up or take you down. And those what do they call it, lifeboats that are forming, you can either gravitate